Today, you will hear from Sarah Mead, our Deputy Superintendent for Early Learning at Aussie, and Tiara Washington, the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Program Manager. Before handing things over to Sarah and Tiara, I'll walk through our agenda. Next slide, please. We will start out tonight's session with an overview of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Next, we'll share how the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will work starting in fiscal year 2024. There will then be time for a Q&A before closing out. And with all of that, I will pass things over to Deputy Superintendent for Early Learning, Sarah Mead.
Thank you so much, Julia, and hello to everyone who's joined this evening's information session. Before we begin, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you early educators for the incredible work that you do every day supporting children's learning and development in the District of Columbia. Our early learning system could not function without you, and we are so grateful for the work that you do and that we have the opportunity to partner with your employers to increase the pay that you very well deserve for the skills and importance of your work. Now I want to begin our session by sharing some background on the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. What is the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund? The Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund is a special fund of the District of Columbia government that was created to increase compensation of early childhood educators who work at child development facilities in the District of Columbia. The program is administered by the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, also referred to as Aussie, and by the Division of Early Learning within Aussie. In fiscal years 2022 and 2023, Aussie partnered with an organization called AidKit, who I suspect many of you have interacted with, to disperse supplemental payments directly to early childhood educators. I will pause here for a moment to remind everyone that there is one payment from AidKit still coming in fiscal year 2023. That payment will be distributed to eligible early childhood educators in September, so next month. Eligible early childhood educators should have received a notification from AidKit confirming your eligibility. If you have questions about the September 2023 payment, please contact AidKit at support@ecepayequity.aidkit.org or 202-831-9298. We'll include that contact information in the chat. Before we move on to talking about next year of the Early Childhood Pay Equity Fund and the changes that will occur, I want to review the results so far. We have distributed millions of dollars to early childhood educators through the program. In fiscal year 2022, 3,217 early childhood educators received payments totaling more than $38 million. And in the first 3 quarters of fiscal year 23 to date, 3,854 early childhood educators have received payments totaling $147,500. We've heard from the early learning community how impactful these payments have been to early childhood educators, and we are excited to be continuing the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in the years ahead. There are some changes coming to how the program is implemented that we want you to be aware of. For more on those changes, I'll hand things over to Tiara Washington. Tiara.
Thank you, Sarah. And hello, everyone. I am happy to meet with you all today and share some information on how the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will work starting in fiscal year 2024 and beyond. Next slide, please. Thank you. In FY24, and FY23, Aussie distributed pay equity funds to early childhood educators through AidKit. And as Sarah noted, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, sorry, I already said that the last payment for 2023 will be in next month, September of this year. So the last payment from AidKit will be distributed in September 2023, which is next month. Next slide. Starting in FY24, pay equity funds will be distributed through child care employers. So Aussie will transition to distributing funds directly to child development facilities for them to use to increase compensation for early childhood educators. Instead of distributing a payment to early educators via AidKit this December, as we did last year, Aussie will distribute funds to child development facilities in December, and facilities will use those funds to increase pay for early childhood educators going forward. The key changes for early childhood educators in FY24. Let's walk through some of the key changes early childhood educators should know about. First, as we've mentioned, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, educators receive funds from AidKit. Starting in FY24, educators will receive funds through their employer. Next, in fiscal years 2022 and in 2023, all educators and eligible staff types could apply to AidKit for funds. Starting in fiscal year 2024, early educators will only receive funds if your employer opts into the program. Employers are not required to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, but are highly encouraged to do so. If you aren't sure if your employer is participating, please talk with them to learn more. Another key change is how payments are received. In fiscal years 2022 and 2023, educators received payments from AidKit via direct deposit or prepaid debit cards. Starting in fiscal year 2024, funds will be included as part of your regular paycheck from your employer. This means that rather than receiving a pay supplement a few times a year, your salary will increase and you'll see the increase reflected in every paycheck. The exact timing of when you will see an increase in your paycheck may vary based on your employer's payroll schedule and when they opt into the program. Please talk with your employer about when you can expect to see the increase in your paycheck. Finally, in fiscal years 2022 and 2023, the payment amount an educator received was based on their staff type. Starting in fiscal year 2024, employers that participate in the program will be required to pay eligible staff a minimum salary that is based on their staff type and the highest credential they hold. We'll talk more about this on the next slide. Okay, before getting further into tonight's presentation, I'd like to highlight a few key terms you'll be hearing and what they mean. First is minimum salaries. Minimum salaries are the salary or wage a child development facility must pay lead teachers and assistant teachers based on their staff type and credentials. These represent a floor, not a ceiling. The exact amount of participating employer pays staff, the exact amount that a participating employer pays staff may exceed, but not be lower than the minimum salaries. Next is regular paycheck. This is the mechanism through which an early childhood educator is paid by their employer on a regular basis, such as weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, depending on your employer. Third, we have staff type. An early childhood educator staff type is their role listed in the Division of Early Learning licensing tool, also known as DELP. There are a number of different staff types. An educator staff type is based on the responsibilities they hold at the facility where they work and their qualifications. If you aren't sure what your staff type is listed as in DELP, please speak with your employer. And finally is highest credential. This is the highest degree or credential that you hold. This might be a high school diploma, child development associate, or a bachelor's degree. As an example, if you have a high school diploma and a CDA, your highest credential is the CDA. As with staff type, this is based on the information listed in DELP. If you aren't sure what your highest credential is listed in DELP, please speak with your employer. If you've earned a credential recently, please make sure to share that information and required supporting documentation with your employer. In order to receive pay equity funds in FY24, your employer must opt in. As I mentioned when we walked through the key changes to the program, in order to receive funds starting in fiscal year 2024, your employer must opt into the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. Facilities that opt in to participate in the program will receive funds from Aussie starting in December of 2023 to pay staff the higher salaries. This is different from previous years when all early childhood educators employed and eligible staff types by Aussie licensed facilities could apply for funds. It is important to note that child development facilities are not required to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, but it is highly encouraged. We encourage early childhood educators to talk with their employers to see if they plan on participating in the program in fiscal year 2024. What does it mean for me if my employer chooses to participate? Let's talk about what all of this means for early childhood educators. If you are employed at a facility that opts into the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your employer is required to pay eligible staff at least the FY24 minimum salaries. Participating employers will include the funds in your regular paycheck if you are employed in an eligible staff type. We'll dive into what the minimum salaries are and the staff types that are eligible in just a bit. It is important to note that employers are not required to pay eligible staff the required minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly CDF payroll funding formula award payment. The first quarterly payment will be distributed in December of 2023 to providers who completed the opt-in process by the Q1 deadline, which is September 30th, 2023. If your employer is participating in the program, ask them when they plan to start implementing the new salaries. I'll note one more time, employees are not required to pay eligible staff the required minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly CDF payroll funding formula award payment in December of 2023. Next slide. Okay. What if my employer chooses not to participate? If you are employed at a facility that does not participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your employer will not be required to pay staff the FY24 minimum salaries. Employers may choose to opt into the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund at any time and receive the next quarterly payment. That means that if your employer doesn't opt in time for the first quarter, they can still opt into the program for future payments. As a reminder, all employers must comply with district and federal laws and regulations related to worker wages and hours, regardless of their participation in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. This includes the Fair Shot Minimum Wage Act of 2016 and for child care providers participating in the district's child care subsidy program, the Living Wage Act of 2006. We'll drop links in the chat where you can learn more about those requirements and where you can get support if you have questions from the Department of Employment Services. Next slide. Next slide. Next, we're going to talk about what staff types are eligible to receive funds. Child development facilities that receive funds from Aussie must pay eligible early childhood educators salaries that meet or exceed the minimum salaries established by Aussie. For the purposes of fiscal year 2024 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, the following staff types in DELT qualify as an assistant teacher: assistant teacher, Montessori assistant teacher, pre-K enhancement and expansion program assistant teacher, also known as PKEEP, associate home caregiver. The following staff types qualify as a lead teacher: teacher, Montessori teacher, expanded home caregiver, and home caregiver. I will underscore again that the amount of funding your employer receives, as well as the minimum salaries they are required to pay, are based on your staff type as listed in DELT, regardless of what you are called at your facility. If you are unsure of your staff type in DELT, please talk with your employer. As a reminder, your staff type is based on your responsibilities at the facility where you work and your qualifications. Just because an individual may hold the credentials required for a role does not necessarily mean that that is their staff type. For example, if you hold the credentials required to be a teacher, that does not necessarily mean that your staff type is teacher. It's also important to note that facilities may, but are not required to adjust compensation for staff in other roles. If you're employed in a staff type that does not qualify as an assistant teacher or lead teacher, such as director, assistant director, and administrative staff, we suggest that you talk with your employer if you have questions about your salary. What are the Assistant Teacher FY24 minimum salaries? So let's dive into the specific minimum salaries. The FY24 minimum salaries are specific to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program. They are not the same as state and federal minimum wage requirements. We know that early childhood educators are paid in a variety of ways. Some of you are paid an annual salary, while some of you are paid on an hourly basis. For that reason, in the slides that follow, we'll talk about both the required minimum annual salaries by staff type and credential, and the hourly equivalents. If you are an hourly employee, your employer must pay you at least the hourly equivalent salary listed in these slides, which may translate into total hourly pay that is higher or lower than the required minimum salaries, depending on how many hours you work. First, we'll discuss salaries for individuals with a staff type in DELT that qualifies as an assistant teacher. Again, this would be individuals who are assistant teachers, Montessori assistant teachers, PKEEP assistant teachers, or associate home caregivers. As a reminder, the minimum salary an educator is eligible to receive is based on their staff type and highest credential. For an assistant teacher whose highest credential is less than child development associate, for example, if you have the credential of a high school diploma or GED, the minimum annual salary is $43,865. This converts to an hourly wage of $21.09 For an assistant teacher whose highest credential is a CDA, the minimum annual salary is $51,006. This converts to an hourly wage of $24.52. And for an assistant teacher whose highest credential is an associate's degree or higher, including if you have a bachelor's or master's degree, the minimum salary is $54,262, which is $26.09 if paid hourly. Employers may choose to pay some staff in these roles or credentials more, but participating employers may not pay less. What are the lead teacher FY24 minimum salaries? Now let's take a look at the minimum salaries for lead teachers. As a reminder, for the purposes of this program, staff types that qualify as a lead teacher are lead teacher, Montessori teacher, expanded home caregiver, and home caregiver. For a lead teacher whose highest credential is a CDA or 48 credit hours with greater than or equal to 15 hours in early childhood education, the minimum salary is $54,262. This converts to an hourly wage of $26.09. For a lead teacher whose highest credential is an associate's degree in early childhood education or an associate's degree with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education, the minimum salary is $63,838. This converts to an hourly wage of $30.69. And finally, for a lead teacher whose highest credential is a bachelor's degree or higher in early childhood education or a bachelor's degree or higher with greater than or equal to 24 credit hours in early childhood education, the minimum annual salary is $75,103. This converts to an hourly wage of $36.11. Again, employers may choose to pay some staff in these roles or credentials more, but participating employers may not pay them any less. How much funding will my employer receive? In order to receive funding from Aussie, a facility must opt in to participate in the program. The amount of funding a facility receives is determined based on a formula that was created for this program. Aussie will calculate the amount of money a facility receives each quarter based on the number of staff at the facility employed in eligible staff types and their highest credentials as documented in DEL. In addition, the formula takes into account the percentage of children enrolled in the facility who participate in the district's child care subsidy program. This component of the formula, known as the equity adjustment, is intended to direct more funding to facilities that serve lower income families and communities. If you're interested in diving further into the formula, we'll drop a link in the chat to where you can learn more. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiara and Sarah. Before moving into our Q&A, we want to do a quick poll. So let me quickly launch that. And our poll question is, please tell us what language you attended today's session in. And if we can advance to the next slide, there we go. We'll give folks a minute or so to answer this. Alrighty, it looks like we have about 75% of our attendees have answered the poll. We'll give folks another 10 seconds. All right. Thank you, everyone who answered our poll. And we will now move into our Q&A. So as a reminder, please use the Q&A feature. If you have any questions, we'll try to answer as many as we can. For questions that are specific, we ask that you email Aussie at aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov, and we'll make sure that is included in the chat. I think for our first question, I will direct that to you, Sarah. Can you clarify when the last payment from Aid Kit is being dispersed?
Yes, thanks for that question. It is a little confusing, I know, because we are still wrapping up 1 year of the program while we are preparing people for the next year. But I am pleased to say that there is one remaining payment that Aid Kit will distribute. They will distribute that payment in September for Q4 of fiscal year 2023. As a reminder, the payments to early childhood educators through Aid Kit have always been distributed at the end of each quarter based on who was employed during that quarter. This is the last quarter of the fiscal year, and it is the last payment that early educators will receive from Aid Kit, however.
Thank you, Sarah. And I can see in the chat, a lot of folks are interested in when exactly the salaries will start being implemented for them. So how will the funds be distributed to educators and when?
Sure, I can take that one. So employers that opt into FY24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will receive quarterly payments that are calculated using the CDF payroll funding formula. The first quarterly payment will be distributed in December 2023 to providers who have completed the opt-in process by September 30th of 2023. Employers are not required to pay eligible staff the FY24 minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly CDF payroll funding formula award payment. Eligible early childhood educators will receive the pay equity funds through their regular paycheck. And we highly encourage you to talk with your employer to see if they'll be participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund in fiscal year 2024 and ask them about their plan for when they'll implement your new salary.
Thank you, Tiara. I'm seeing a number of questions with folks who aren't sure what their staff type is. So if you're not sure what your staff type is, maybe you're not sure if you're a teacher or an assistant teacher, what's the plan of action there?
We highly encourage educators to consult with their employer to find out what their staff type is in DELP. And if that staff type is incorrect, work with your employer to provide any missing documentation to ensure that we have the most up-to-date staff type in DELP.
Thank you. I'm seeing a question about taxes. So are educators required to pay taxes on the money that they receive?
I'll take that question. Starting with the fiscal year 24 program we're talking about right now, your employer will be required to pay employer payroll and other taxes and withholding taxes, just as they are for other wages and salaries that are distributed through your paycheck. Early childhood educators may wish to consult with an accountant or other tax expert to find out whether the increase in pay will impact your tax liability, as tax implications may vary depending on your individual and family circumstances. I want to reiterate, though, that what I just said applies to the payments for fiscal year 24, which will be coming through your regular paycheck. As you those of you who received payments in fiscal year 22 have learned the payments that were distributed directly to early childhood educators through Aid Kit are payments that did not have taxes withheld from them, and you will need to pay taxes on those potentially when you file your taxes for calendar year 2023. Again, in that case, you may wish to consult with a tax expert or an accountant, as we did in this past year. Aussie will share information about resources for tax preparation support at that time. So even though we will shift to this program, if you received payments during calendar year 2023 directly from Aid Kit, it is possible that you may need to pay taxes on those when you do your taxes for 2023, which you will do in early 2024.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing a number of questions related to the type of degree that folks have and how that aligns to the payment amount or the minimum salary that they're eligible for. So for instance, if you have a bachelor's degree in a field that is not related to early childhood education, and you do not have those 24 semester credit hours in early childhood education, what would the minimum salary be? Or how can you determine the minimum salary that is yours?
Sure. So the FY24 minimum salary for an eligible lead teacher and assistant teacher is based on their role and highest credential that they hold. For example, if you are in a staff type that qualifies as a lead teacher and have a bachelor's degree in a field that's not related to ECE, and you do not have at least 24 semester credit hours in ECE, you would qualify for the minimum salary for a lead teacher with a CDA. If you have a staff type that qualifies as the lead teacher and you have an associate's degree in a field that is not related to ECE, and you do not have at least 24 semester credit hours in ECE, you would qualify for the minimum salary for a lead teacher with a CDA. Early childhood educators who need support pursuing education credentials are encouraged to visit the Aussie ECE resources webpage to find more information on programs and available supports. You may also contact the ECE help desk for support, and we will drop links to those resources in the chat.
Thank you, Tiara. I'm seeing a question here about monitoring. So how is Aussie monitoring to make sure that employers are paying their staff the money that the funds are to pay them for their salaries?
Sure. So Aussie will be monitoring facilities that participate in the program in order to ensure that they are providing, that they are meeting the minimum salary requirements for eligible early childhood educators through the form of proof of that payroll, payroll documentation proving that they are meeting the minimum salary requirements for eligible early childhood educators.
And on a similar topic, so are employers allowed to spend the funds they receive from Aussie on things other than paying staff?
Okay, so employers must use the funding they receive from Aussie for the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund to meet the minimum salary requirements for lead and assistant teachers. Employers may also use funds to pay staff wages or compensation for additional early childhood educators and other child development facility employees. Providers may also pay the cost of health and other fringe benefits for early childhood educators and other child development facility employees, as well as pay administrative costs associated with implementing the minimum salary requirements and or meeting Aussie's requirements related to the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. And lastly, they may use the funds to pay direct operating expenses of the facility associated with providing care and early childhood education services to children. Employers must meet the minimum salary requirements for staff in covered roles, so the assistant teachers and lead teachers, before they use funds for other purposes.
Thanks, Tiara. Our next question I'm going to ask Sarah to answer, where I'm seeing some questions about how long this program is going to last. So will the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund continue in future years? And if it is the process going to be the same?
Yes, thank you for that question. So this program is created as a special fund of district government. The statute creating that program does not have an expiration date, meaning unless something changes by the DC Council, the program will continue. Any program operated by DC government is dependent on whether the council changes the legislation at some point in the future. So that is a potential way it could change, and is subject to the annual budget process. So it is possible that funding for the program could be changed in the future, either up or down. Aussie is operating on the assumption, however, that the program will remain in place until we are informed otherwise. And so we are putting this in place as if it is a permanent program and expect it to continue. In terms of the process, we did implement a temporary process in 2022 and 23 that distributed funds directly to early educators. The process we are transitioning to now, where the funds go to child development facilities to pay their staff, is intended to be the permanent process for this program. There may be some changes in how funds are distributed to facilities, or how the program is monitored, or the requirements related to the minimum salary in the future. But we do not expect the overall shape of the process to change, and any changes such as those I just mentioned will be communicated widely to the early learning community.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing a question here about if you change jobs or start working at a different facility. So if you change facilities, will you continue to receive the payments?
Sure. So if you take a job at another facility that is participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund program, and you are employed in an eligible staff type, your new employer is required to pay you at least the minimum salary for FY24 that aligns with your staff type and credentials. If you take a job at another facility and that facility is not participating in FY24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your new employer is not required to pay the FY24 minimum salary for your role and credentials, but they must comply with other district and or federal laws and requirements regarding worker wages and hours that apply to all employees, including the Fair Shot Minimum Wage Act of 2016, and for child care providers participating in the district's child care subsidy program, the Living Wage Act of 2006.
Thanks, Tiara. A question from an educator wondering if their employer does not want to participate in the Pay Equity Fund, can teachers register on their own?
No. Consistent with the legislation, Aussie will cease making direct payments to early childhood educators through Aid Kit.
Thanks, Tiara. Can Sarah or Tiara, can you speak a little bit more to why employers are not required to participate in the program?
Yes, I can take that. So in the District of Columbia, early childhood programs are private businesses or nonprofits who set their own budgets and make their own decisions about who they hire and how they set compensation, subject to laws that apply to all employers in the district. In some cases, child care providers do participate in public funding programs such as child care subsidy or PKEEP, and now the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. And when child care employers participate in any of those programs, they must agree to adhere to the requirements for those programs. So the requirement of childcare providers that participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund is that they increase compensation for their staff. However, that is tied to choosing to participate in the fund. And because childcare providers are private employers, they have the ability to choose whether or not to participate in this program, just as they have the ability to choose whether to accept childcare subsidies, whether to participate in the pre-K enhancement and expansion program. Our goal is to encourage as many childcare employers as possible to participate in the program and to provide support necessary to make that possible for early childhood programs. And we are continuing to work on that right now. However, at the end of the day, it is the choice of the childcare employer whether to participate. We will share information about whether childcare providers are participating in the program or not, so that early childhood educators, when looking for employment, have access to that information and can make informed decisions.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing some questions from educators wondering if there's an application that they need to complete to receive funds in fiscal year 24. Tiara, could you speak to that?
Sure. So the child development facilities will complete the opt-in process for FY24 in order to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. So there is no requirement for educators to complete an application. As we shared, Aussie is going to be distributing the payments directly to the child development facilities. And the facilities are going to increase the salaries through their regular paychecks after they receive their first CDF payroll funding formula award for the quarter that they opt in into the program if they choose.
And a question around eligibility. So if you work in an eligible staff type, meaning if you're a teacher or an assistant teacher, but you work part-time, are you still eligible to receive a minimum salary?
Yes, you are still eligible to receive the minimum salary if you work in a part-time role. Yes.
And another question, I know we've been using the word salaries a lot. Can these requirements be paid at an hourly rate?
So if you are an hourly employee, we have, I think, we shared during the presentation and dropped in the chat the chart of the minimum salaries. We broke those down by annual salaries as well as hourly wages. So if your child development facility chooses to participate in pay equity in FY24, your employer will need to meet the minimum salary requirements for you as the hourly wages are listed, if that makes sense. Sorry. You will use the hourly reference instead of the annual reference, and your employer will need to meet that minimum salary based on your role and credentials. But also want to note that that salary may be more or less depending on how many hours you actually work.
Thanks, Tiara. A number of questions related to credentials that people hold, specifically for individuals who are still studying or working towards a degree. So for example, if you're in an associate's degree program, you're still working towards that degree, you have not completed the program yet, can you receive the payment as if you already have that degree? Or will you not get that salary amount until you have obtained the associate's degree?
So educators will not receive that salary until they obtain that credential. So for example, if you, so the FY24 minimum salary for an eligible lead teacher An assistant teacher is based on their role and credentials. If you obtain a higher degree or credential, your employer must update your record in DELT and include the required supporting documentation. And if you are unsure of what your credentials are documented as in DELT, please talk with your employer. But educators will not receive that payment or that salary until they meet that credential.
Thank you, Tiara. Our next question, I think, is one for Sarah. Will the minimum salary requirements remain the same each fiscal year, or will this be recalculated in fiscal year 25?
That's a great question. Aussie is required to review the minimum salary requirements annually and make recommendations regarding whether they should be changed. For example, if the DCPS salary scale increases, any changes subject to the availability of sufficient funding for the program. So the salaries will not automatically increase just because the DCPS salary schedule does. It will depend on the funding that Aussie has available.
Thank you. Another question we have, and this is, I think, related to the question that we received about changing jobs. So will your salary follow you if you decide to go to another child development facility that is licensed by Aussie in DC? Tiara, you're muted.
Sorry. If you move to a facility that is participating in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, they will be required to pay you at least the minimum salary that aligns with your staff type and your credentials. So it's important that your employer maintains updated records in DELT in order to make sure that you are reflected at the correct staff type and credential. So we highly encourage educators, if you are transitioning to new child development facilities, to make sure that your employer has all of the documentation needed to keep your record or update your record in DELT.
Thank you, Tiara. A question at more of a facility level. So can facilities that do not accept child care subsidies participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, we highly encourage non-subsidy providers to complete the opt-in process for FY24. Subsidy providers as well as non-subsidy providers are able to participate in FY24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund. So yes, get your application in as soon as possible in order to make sure you meet the Q1 deadline. So that's September 30th. As a reminder for
speaking of applications, is there a hard deadline for facilities to opt in, or is it more of a rolling application process?
So the application process is a rolling process for facilities. However, facilities or providers need to be mindful of the quarterly deadlines in order to be eligible to receive a payment, a CDF payroll funding formula award for that particular quarter. So we will share a link to where you can read more about what those quarterly deadlines are to further inform your conversations with your employer.
Thank you, Tiara. I'm seeing some questions about how the funds are actually received. So a question here, can employers make a lump sum payment in fiscal year 24, like how educators received last summer when they received up to $14,000? Can they do that in fiscal year 24?
No, as we shared, the funds are going directly to the early childhood development facilities, and employers are required to pay eligible staffs via their regular paychecks. So there will not be a lump sum payment. Instead, these payments will be included in your regular paychecks.
I would like to also add to that in the 2 years to date, there was a fixed amount that early childhood educators received based on your staff type. However, the program is more complicated in the coming year because the amount of minimum salary that people receive is going to depend on both staff type and credentials. And that means that in some cases, your increase in pay may be more than the amount you received from Aid Kit. And in other cases, it may be less than the amount that you received from Aid Kit. So I strongly encourage people to look at the table of minimum salaries that Tiara shared earlier in the presentation to understand how your pay may be affected by this program. That may be not the same as the amount of money you received from Aid Kit.
Thank you, Sarah. Another question. So can you speak a little bit more to how the minimum salary for an educator is determined? I'm seeing a question here. Is there any factoring in how many years you've worked in childcare that goes into the salary you receive?
I'll take that. Currently, the salaries that are required as the minimum salaries by Aussie are based solely on credential and staff type. They do not include consideration of experience. However, a child development facility may choose to adopt a salary schedule that does include differences in pay based on experience, because this program provides funds to your employer that they can use to compensate you, but ultimately early childhood educators will be paid by your employer. And as long as they are meeting the minimums, if they're participating in pay equity, they can make decisions to vary pay in other ways as long as they meet the minimums.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm seeing a question, and this one's related to the formula payment. So what if the facility's enrollment declines during the year? Would that affect the amount of money that a facility receives?
I can take that as well. The amount of money a facility receives is based on the staff, the eligible staff that they have in the Division of Early Learning licensing system. And then if the facility participates in subsidy, their pay will be adjusted based on the percentage of their license capacity that is occupied by children participating in the district's subsidy program. So in general, the payment is based on the number of eligible staff in a facility, not enrollment. However, changes in subsidy enrollment could change the total amount of funding that a facility receives over time.
Thank you. I'm continuing to see some questions from educators who are working on degrees. So they're currently enrolled in a program, but they have not obtained a CDA, an associate's degree, or a bachelor's degree. Tara, could you just reiterate how exactly the minimum salary for an individual is determined?
Sure. Sorry. Okay. So that the FY24 minimum salaries for an eligible lead teacher and assistant teacher is based on their role and credentials. So let me give some examples, and maybe it might be helpful if we pull back up the chart. Okay, so I will just speak to them. So if you are an assistant teacher whose highest credential is less than a CDA, so that means you have a high school diploma or a GED, The minimum annual salary is $43,865. And this converts to an hourly wage of $21.09. If you are an assistant teacher whose highest credential is a CDA, the minimum annual salary is $51,006, converted to an hourly wage of $24.52. If you are an assistant teacher whose highest credential is an associate's degree or higher, that includes if you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, the minimum annual salary is $54,262, which is $26.09 if paid hourly. Important to note here that employers may choose to pay some staff in these roles or credentials more, but participating employers may not pay them less. And we have a link in the chat for you to visually see this chart to find where you would fall within this, within the salary.
Thank you, Tiara. I'm seeing a question here about related to an eligible, if a staff type is eligible. Are individuals who are employed as substitutes eligible to receive funds through this program?
So again, the eligible staff types are lead teacher and assistant teacher. If your employer is participating in FY24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, your employer is required to meet the minimum salary requirement for lead teachers and assistant teachers. After those requirements are met, employers can choose to use funds in order to increase salaries of other early childhood development center staff.
And what if an employer cannot afford to pay the minimum salary requirement, but has opted into the program? Will they still be eligible to participate? Maybe Sarah, this is one you can help answer.
Yes. So the eligibility of an employer to participate depends on them being a licensed program that is licensed by Aussie and serves children birth through 5 and entering into an agreement with Aussie. The agreement does require childcare providers to pay staff the minimum wages. However, if a program chooses to enter into that agreement and finds it is unable to meet those salaries, Aussie will take a variety of steps to work with the program to try to bring them into compliance with the requirements. I can't speak to circumstances beyond that because when we say the provider cannot afford to pay the salaries, that could mean a variety of things. And so it would depend on the individual circumstance. However, we are committed to working with programs that opt into the program to try to help them be successful and come into compliance. And there is not a current salary requirement in order to enter into the program before the pay equity funds are distributed. Other than that, you need to be following the law regarding minimum wages in the district and other applicable federal and district laws.
Thank you. And we have some folks wondering a bit about how exactly the funding amount a facility receives is calculated. Maybe we could go back to that slide that showed a little bit more about the CDF payroll funding formula. And Tiara, could you speak to that?
Sure.
And Rachel, that's a slide that says how much funding will my employer receive? Thank you.
All righty. So as we walk through, the CDF payroll funding formula award will include the number of eligible educators by staff type and credential. In addition to that, if the provider is a subsidy provider, it will include the percent of children enrolled in subsidy, in addition to an administrative enhancement award, which will equal the total award amount. So I believe we put in the chat a link to where you can read more about the CDF payroll funding formula and a breakdown of the different components that make up the total CDF payroll funding formula award.
Thank you. Let's see, another question. If you leave your job before your employer receives the funds, can you still receive payments?
So I think this question may reflect some confusion between the first 2 years of the program and what the program will look like going forward. In the first 2 years of the program, early childhood educators were required to be employed by a certain date and to remain employed until they received a payment through AidKit. However, once the program transitions to distributing payments to child development facilities, early childhood educators whose employers participate in the program will receive payments as part of their regular paycheck from their employer. So after you are no longer employed by an employer, that employer will at some point cease to provide you a paycheck after they've met all the payments they're obligated to provide you. And then you would not receive any pay from this program because you would no longer be employed.
Thank you, Sarah. Since we've been talking about credentials a good bit, I do want to pose the question that I'm seeing here. If I achieve a new credential in the middle of the year, will my salary change?
Sure, I can speak to that. If you achieve a higher credential, your employer must update your record in DELT and include the required supporting documentation. If you obtain a credential between quarterly payments from Aussie to your employer is not required to meet the FY24 minimum salary aligned to your new credential until they receive their next quarterly payment from Aussie, in which their CDF payroll funding formula award was calculated to reflect your new credential. So if you are unsure of your credentials documented in DELT or the minimum salary requirements, please talk with your employer.
Thank you, Tiara. I'm continuing to see some questions about the timing of when educators will see a change in their pay. Can we address that question again? When exactly will early childhood educators start seeing these funds?
Sure. So employers that opt into FY24 of the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund will receive quarterly payments that are calculated using the CDF payroll funding formula. And employers are not required to pay eligible staff the FY24 minimum salaries until after they receive their first quarterly CDF payroll funding formula award payment. We encourage educators to talk with your employer about their plan for implementing the minimum salaries. The quarterly payment schedule that details when Aussie will deliver funds to participate in facilities in FY24 can be found in the chat, which will link to the Educator FAQs. But for the purposes of this meeting, the Q1 deadline for providers is September 30th to opt into the program, with the first quarterly payment being dispersed or distributed to centers in December of 2023. So providers will not be required to start meeting the minimum salaries until after they receive that payment, that Q1 payment in December of 2023, if they opt into the program by the September 30th deadline.
Thank you. Some questions specifically from home providers. So that would be child development homes or child development expanded homes. Sarah, could you help answer this? Are homes able to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund?
Yes, homes and expanded child development homes are eligible to participate in the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund if they're licensed by Aussie and if they submit an application and complete an agreement. There are a few things to be aware of. I know it is a little bit confusing because we keep talking about teachers and assistant teachers. However, the Pay Equity Fund legislation defines teachers as including home and expanded home providers and assistant teachers as including associate home caregivers. So homes are included in the fund. If you are a home that has employees, your formula amount will be based on your number of employees, including yourself as the home provider or expanded home provider. If you are a home that does not have any employees besides the home provider or expanded home provider, you are still eligible to receive funding for your facility if you opt to participate based on the home provider who is treated as an employee for the purposes of calculating the amount a facility is eligible to receive, even though the home provider is typically also the business owner.
Thank you, Sarah. And we know that some facilities do not operate year-round. Some facilities operate 9 months out of the year. What does it mean for staff who are employed at a facility that might operate for 9 months out of the year?
So for facilities who operate for 9 months out of the year, I believe that you will be responsible for making the payments for the period in which your facility is operating. And I will defer to Sarah if that is accurate or if that works differently for centers operating less than 12 months a year.
So the annual salary requirements are based on the assumption of a full-time year-round worker. Staff who are working different arrangements should be paid based on the appropriate equivalent using the hourly rates to calculate that.
And I'm seeing some questions about an application. I will take this time to clarify that early childhood educators for fiscal year 24, there is no application. So if you're an early childhood educator, you can sit tight. There's no application for you. However, if you own or operate a child development facility, there is an application. And Tiara, could you just give a quick reminder about where the owner operators would have received a notification about completing the opt-in process?
Yes, so if you are the owner operator of a facility, you would have received an email with a link that will take you directly to the application within DELP. So if you are the owner operator of a facility and you did not receive that email, please check your spam or junk folders. We know that sometimes emails get stuck in those spam or junk email inboxes. If you still are unable to locate that email, please send us an email at aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov, and we can help troubleshoot and make sure that you get a link to complete that application and support you throughout the application process if you have questions or challenges.
And I just want to underscore the deadline to apply for the Q4 FY23 aid kit payment for early educators has already closed. So if you are an early childhood educator who is an employee, you don't have to submit any other applications. The only folks who would need to submit applications are facility provider owners and home and expanded home providers as the owner or the operator of your facility.
Thank you, Sarah and Tiara. Keeping an eye on the time, I think I will move us through to our close. For folks who did not have their question addressed or have outstanding questions, we encourage you to email us. We will include the email address where you can send questions about the Pay Equity Fund to in the chat. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone who has joined us tonight. And before closing, I do want to share some tips for how early childhood educators can prepare for changes that are coming to the program. If we can just go back one slide, please. Can we go back one slide, please? So first, we encourage you to talk with your employer. Ask them if they plan to participate in the program in fiscal year 24. And if they do plan to participate, ask when staff can expect to see their salaries increase. Second, we encourage you to confirm your staff type with your employer. Your staff type is in the Division of Early Learning Licensing tool and is based on your responsibilities where you work and your qualifications. And if you're not sure what your staff type is, again, please do talk with your employer. And then third, make sure your information is up to date. If you've recently received a new credential, make sure you've provided your employer documentation of that credential so they can upload it in the Division of Early Learning Licensing tool. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined tonight's information session. For more information on the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund, please visit the Aussie website. You can find that at aussie.dc.gov/FY24 ECE Pay Equity. We also encourage you to check out the Frequently Asked Questions document for early childhood educators. This document answers a lot of questions we've heard from the early learning community. And then finally, as we mentioned previously, for questions, please email us at aussie.ecepayequity@dc.gov. Thank you again for everyone who joined tonight's session. A recording will be shared and posted on the Aussie website in the coming days. I'd also like to remind folks that we will be hosting a similar session on Saturday morning from 10 to 11:30. You can find the link to register in the same invite that you used to register for this session. So thank you again. Please send us your questions and everyone have a good night.